We're at a local Doug egg farm, and this is all that's left, an empty barn and acres of pasture after farmers say their entire flock was euthanized. They're now asking lawmakers for help to prevent this. The ducks roamed happily and freely until just days before Christmas, when Elaine Kellner, owner of Hearth and Haven Farm, noticed a few of her birds were sick. She says she and her husband tried over-the-counter medicine to save them, but nothing seemed to be working.
I think I've got to call this in. It could be bird flu. And we just kind of looked at each other, and there was just that moment where we just knew, yeah, it could be the end. We had to know.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Straight Talk with Shauna Rankin. Myself, you usually do not see my face for these Straight Talks, and frequently for Meet My Neighbor Productions. It is something that we release kind of the backside and longer length of a lot of the interviews we do. Today is something a bit different. We personally had been going through our usual prep for spring things. And whenever I was at a feed shop locally, I recognized a rather uncommon occurrence. There's always an excitement for chick days and the coming of spring and flock increase. But the particular feed shop I was at, there was a very long line for new day-old chicks. And the progression of the next several days and into the week was that there was a line forming before they would open several hours in advance. And they were selling out. The first time I was there and watching, it sold out in a matter of, I think, 10 minutes, 15 minutes from the time they started selling their baby chicks. The second time I saw it, it took a bit longer. But either way, I was recognizing this rather significant uptick in people wanting to participate in having the backyard flock of some capacity. And then it spurred me to think about what was causing this mass, all these long lines and this need and want. I recognize the shortage of eggs and the larger issue that we're facing in the world as a whole in regards to the avian influenza, but this new strand of this HPAI is really wreaking a lot of havoc. And I know there's been words exchanged or people, discussing whether it's valid or not valid, or thing and not a thing. But whenever we took the information from our own local feed shop and came home and started doing our own research and digging a bit, whenever we came across the Department of Agriculture's Federal Registrar notices, we recognized that there was a notice posted asking for comments on what they're currently doing, because they haven't really changed in a long time their response to this particular issue with the avian influenza. And so they were asking for remarks. And within the comments, there were only 13 that we had cited, but within was one in particular that we found quite interesting. And so I reached out to this gal and wanted to chat with her further. Long story put short, to introduce you to Elaine with Hearth and Haven Farms. Welcome, Elaine. Thank you very much for joining me and on my maiden voyage of this kind of version of a conversation. So I greatly appreciate you participating there.
Absolutely.
If you will, just tell everyone who you are, where you're at, and what you do.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Elaine Kellner, and I own and operate Hearth and Haven Farm. We're located in Monroe, Washington, about an hour northeast of Seattle.
Okay, very good. And what do you do?
We, up until recently, raised ducks on pasture for duck eggs. Duck eggs were our signature product. We have a diversified farm, so we also raise some specialty vegetables, herbs, garnishes and edible flowers, some pork, and some Thanksgiving turkey as well.
Okay, so kind of jumping to the heart of what brought you and I together to have this conversation, can you let's start by walk me through what changes took place for you guys not too long ago. Tell me that story.
So everything kind of went down in December. So we had noticed our usual seasonal decline in egg laying. As we all know, birds are seasonal layers and you always get a drop in winter. And it started dropping more than we expected. We had not done a late summer hatch, which we normally do. So we have young layers coming online right around the start of the new year. So we were at first just attributing it to that. We just didn't have as many young birds. But when we would have been expecting, 30 to 40 eggs a day, we started getting maybe 15. And then all of a sudden it dropped to 5 or 6. And then we started seeing the first sick bird. So we found one of our pet ducks, one of the original 3 that we'd started with in our small backyard before we turned everything into a farm. This was a cayuga duck named Ichi, and she suddenly appeared very lethargic. She was off her feed, just couldn't move around properly. So we moved her to a sick bay and checked on everyone again the next morning. And all of a sudden 3 more ducks were exhibiting the same sort of lethargy. And we realized that we had something going on. This was on December 21st. So we contacted our State Department of Agriculture immediately. We were actually in the middle of a snowstorm at the time. And here in Washington, that's not terribly common. And even an inch of snow shuts down everything in the Seattle area. But thankfully, a representative from the WSDA was able to come out to test our birds that same day. And she took the samples off and they shipped them out to the state lab for testing. Unfortunately, due to the weather delay, the transport company lost the samples and they were not able to make it to the lab.
Okay.
And then we hit the Christmas holiday, and of course, everything shut down. So we had no test results. We were under a quarantine order from the state in case it was bird flu, HPAI.
Yeah.
So we weren't able to take any of the ducks to a vet or anything because we couldn't transport them off the property. So we spent the Christmas holiday working with our vet over the phone, doing what we could to try to nurse the birds through what at the time was a mystery disease. We had many losses and it was incredibly difficult. And then after the Christmas holiday on December 28th, the state employee was able to return to the farm, take a new round of samples, and the state employees actually formed a relay to hand deliver the samples over the mountains to Eastern Washington to the state lab. So we were able to get the test results that evening, which were positive for HPAI. And the following morning on December 29th, the state and the USDA were out to depopulate the entire property.
Okay. Now, that's a pretty big sweep as far as you say the entire property. And if you could, let's kind of walk through the gap of time a little bit from whenever there was a suspected, who knows, mystery disease to the culling of all of the flock. So what were you bearing witness to during that time frame? If you could walk me through that.
It was incredibly difficult, but in some ways kind of heartening. So we only raised turkeys seasonally for Thanksgiving. So turkeys were off our property by that point. Okay. So as a waterfowl farm, we basically had just ducks and geese on hand. So I can speak to the experience with waterfowl. Our geese were very susceptible to the disease. We lost all of them in fairly short order. The symptoms were lethargy. They didn't really want to walk. They kind of just sat around. If they did walk, they would move very slowly. Then they'd start possibly showing some like respiratory symptoms, little, nasal discharge, eye discharge, something like that. They may not. Then they would start, shaking their head as though they were trying to clear it. They'd get very pale. So their bills and legs would look strangely pale. And then the worst neurologic symptoms would start, seizures and such. And then very shortly after that, usually they would pass away once those symptoms started. I don't know if we want to get very graphic, but with one of our geese, a new gander actually that we'd gotten for breeding this spring, incredibly nice goose. We really loved him. My husband was especially attached. He got a very bad case of seizures, unfortunately, and we elected to cull him to try to end his suffering. And unfortunately, the tool available to us was an axe, and my husband was unfortunately not able to make a clean kill due to the seizing of the bird. So it was incredibly difficult. We had to cull a number of our own pets. We had a group of pet ducks that we kept, those that we were just too attached to and couldn't bear to part with.
I understand that.
And those were the older birds, generally speaking. Yeah. They were the oldest among our flock, so they were a bit more vulnerable. So either, they passed away from the disease, or if, we were sure that they weren't going to make it, we had to elect to cull them as well. So that was very difficult going through that. The birds definitely suffered. We did everything we could for them. Unfortunately, this was also in the middle of not only the Christmas holiday, but that big snowstorm. So we had repeated power outages. There was freezing rain. There was really cold blowing wind. So trying desperately to keep them all as warm and comfortable as we could. We were giving them, injectable over-the-counter antibiotics since we didn't know what this was. And we were trying to nurse them through whatever illness this might have been. Of course, as time went on, we became more and more certain that it was HPAI, and that what we were doing wasn't going to help. But we just kept trying just in case. Kind of ruined Christmas, I'm afraid. And the heartening part was that 90% of our flock survived. They made it through the infection. They either showed mild symptoms or in some cases none at all. And we saw a dramatic difference between the natural resistance of each breed. We were very diversified flock here. We had 11 different breeds in the flock, and we were working on developing our own new duck breed that would be productive out on pasture. So we had not only a lot of purebred individuals, but we had a lot of our own crossbreeds, and they proved to have wonderful resistance to this. I think we only lost one of our own crossbreeds. And then we saw some differences like Saxony ducks and magpie ducks and ancona ducks especially seem to be more vulnerable to the disease. The anconas, even though we had some young, very healthy birds that were just hatched last spring, they unfortunately were hit very hard and died very quickly. Other breeds like khaki Campbells and Indian runners, we didn't have a single loss. And in fact, they never even demonstrated any symptoms aside from not laying. They were a little bit off their feed for a couple of days. We'd see that roll through, sort of each of our sub flocks. They would not really eat. They, of course, weren't laying. Some individuals would, get more or less sick. We would have some losses. And then we would sort of pass peak mortality in about 48 hours, and then they would start returning to health. So the hardest part was that by the time of the cull, due to this accidental delay in getting those test results, the survivors were back to health, and we were past peak mortality. The very last flock was sort of just having its final losses, and they were eating again, running around in the fields, playing, mating, doing all of the things that happy, healthy ducks should do. So having the cull then was extremely difficult.
Yeah, and that was really kind of what shook me the most when reading your comment that you had submitted in the registrar, is that I was very frustrated whenever I heard such a beautiful survival story, and then that they were still culled. So why was that decision made? Is that something that is a standard procedure? Walk us through a little bit of your understanding of why that choice was made.
Yeah, so our understanding is that the USDA for about the last year and a half or so has had basically a zero tolerance policy to HPAI. If any individual in any flock tests positive, the entire flock and probably the entire, all birds on the premises are depopulated. That changed last November. They decided at that point, the USDA decided that states could elect, if they chose, if they felt it was appropriate, to quarantine some or all birds on a property rather than culling, if they felt that that was appropriate for stopping the spread of the disease. Some states, for example, Alaska, will kind of evaluate on a case-by-case basis and decide whether or not some flocks or some groups of birds on a property can be left under quarantine. I know that in Virginia, it depends on the proximity to larger commercial facilities. So if you have a backyard flock that's close to a commercial property, they may elect to cull, whereas if it's, further away from some confined animal feeding operations, they may allow property owners to quarantine their flocks. Here in Washington state, the state basically never changed its policy. They just continued with that zero tolerance, elimination only policy, where if any bird tests positive, the entire flock is going to be depopulated. All animals on that property will be depopulated. They have not seen it spread to adjacent properties in most cases, which we found really interesting. We have immediate neighbors who have flocks of mostly smaller scales, but they have chickens, they have ducks. peacocks, pheasants, all sorts of things, right next door to us. And none of them have gotten sick. We've been in touch with our neighbors and they're all just fine. So the method of spread is still a little bit up in the air, but as best as anyone can determine, it's via contact with wild waterfowl, so migratory ducks and geese that are coming through. We are in excellent land for wild ducks, for ducks and waterfowl in general, which is why we started a duck farm here. We're just 2 miles from the Skykomish River, which is a major waterway that migratory waterfowl will stop at. And we certainly see them coming by our property all the time. So that's how we believe that the virus came here, was from a bird either coming over or just dropping in for a visit. It could have just been that they flew overhead and defecated while they were flying by. So stopping the spread via culling and culling only seems a little short-sighted to us.
Well, yeah, especially since from my understanding, it is largely affected by wild flocks or birds in general, and that kind of spread. So that leads me to a question in regards to the management of your flock. So if you could paint me a mental picture of how you all operate, and we're going to do this specifically comparing to a commercial operation or large scale commercial operation. So typically a chicken house is a confined space, usually, within a building, if not like a small access, yes or no, depends on, how they operate. But versus that kind of an operation and yours, can you kind of walk me through what yours looks like and what that varying degree looks like in the instance of an outbreak?
We're very different. That's actually kind of why we started this farm, was because our focus is on animal welfare. And as consumers, we were going to the grocery store saying, we want to get eggs from birds that were treated very well. And we just felt like we couldn't trust the existing labeling at the time. Does free range really mean free range? How much outdoor access do those birds actually get? So that's why we decided to get a couple of birds for our own little backyard flock. And we loved it so much, and everyone loved the eggs so much, that it kind of grew into a farm. So with those principles in mind, we set this up so that our birds have wonderful, extensive outdoor access. They are on green grass and under blue skies every day. We have basically large modified sheds, 20 by 20 sheds, that each commercial or each production flock will be locked up inside at night to keep them safe from predators. And then during the day, each group of 80 to 100 birds would have about 3/4 of an acre to roam, with green grass and trees and shade structures and netting to keep both predators and also potential wild ducks and geese away from them. Each also had access to a seasonal pond, a natural seasonal pond, which would dry up in summer, and then also a basically a stock tank as a year-round swimming pool. Everyone was also fed the best quality, organic, locally milled, non-GMO feed that we could get, which we would buy in bulk and store in large quantities here to make sure that they always had the best of everything on hand. So basically as spoiled as possible. And we had 2 large production flocks and then also a pet flock that was in a slightly smaller field immediately adjacent to our barn as well. Those were the most spoiled of them all. Lots of mealworms for those girls.
Right. So that would be rad. That's hard to sterilize.
It is.
To put it frank. And from what I was reading, it's 120 days of sterilization after the culling. So not only are you being completely wiped out by what seems to be a healthy flock, then you also are now having to reset for 120 days. And you can't, comparatively speaking, I do not operate a large scale commercial, chicken house. So I don't know the logistics, but I presume that the cleaning of that facility would be a little bit more expedited than in your scenario. So what does the impact look like? Because you weren't this wasn't just a backyard flock for your own family. You were in commercial production, just a different variation version versus the big scale operations. So what impacts what does that actually look like? You mentioned you guys bulk buy your feed. So I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, they say that in this process of whenever they're trying to, I guess, manage collateral damage, they say that there is a reimbursement program, but you're firsthand, what does that look like to you? What does that, or does that not cover? How did that turn out?
It's very inadequate. So yeah, with our situation, because you can't really sterilize soil, yeah, we are completely shut down for 120 days. So that's 4 months of quarantine where we are not allowed to have any poultry on the property, move any poultry equipment on or off the property, including feed, carriers, water buckets, anything like that. So anything to do with that can't have it on or off. We've also been advised that should we visit any other property that may have poultry, to take additional steps to make sure that, say our shoes and pants and clothing is all, sterilized, run a car through the car wash before we go to any property that might have birds, et cetera, just to make sure that we're not accidentally tracking the virus around. So it's, definitely a super heightened extra security here. For us, of course, that's incredibly devastating for a confinement operation. And here in Washington, there was an incident just a couple weeks before us, a bit further south of us, which probably was unrelated, but they do not know how that facility contracted HPAI. But one of these million chicken confinement operations found that they had sudden mortality, a bunch of sick birds. They were tested. Turns out that it was HPAI. They depopulated those barns. And in that case, they're allowed to reset basically within the week. They have to clear everything out, dispose of the birds, sterilize the barns. So you're basically scrubbing everything down with some sort of sterilizing agent. And then you just restock. You go to your contracted hatchery, you get your new birds, you shove everything back in, and you're right back in business. They do not have to endure that lengthy shutdown, and they are also compensated for all of that. So they're compensated for the value of the birds that are culled, and also for the time and materials that it takes to sanitize and reset. We do not get really any of that. We are being compensated for the supposed value of the birds. It is unfortunately completely inadequate. We actually just received the check last night for a bit over $6,000 for the destruction of our entire business. So definitely not adequate, especially not considering the bloodlines that we lost as we were working to develop, this new breed of birds, the exceptional individuals that we lost that were sort of the foundation of our flock. In addition to being shut down entirely for 4 months. So now, this was our primary farm income was the duck eggs. So that's gone. So we've got none of that. We also have the additional expenses of sanitizing and resetting our own barns, because of course we did have, these shelters for the birds, these overnight facilities. We are not compensated even for that because as a quote backyard operation, since we have less than 20,000 birds, we are considered a backyard operation, not commercial. So we don't get any compensation for that, nothing for the fallow fields, nothing for the feed either. So we still have we have 5 tons of feed worth about $10,000 that we have in storage here. That's that top of the line, good quality organic feed that under the terms of the quarantine order, we are not allowed to sell, move, give away. We can't even dispose of it because it's considered a biohazard. So it's still sitting here in our garage, all stacked up. Wonderful, excellent, top quality feed that had not been exposed to any birds. It's stored separately and appropriately, in its own building. But because it could be contaminated, we can't get rid of it. But also because it's sealed in bags and it is not contaminated, then we can't do anything else with it and they won't pay us for it. So it's a horrible catch-22 in that case. So the on top of that, the additional difficulty is that this feed, which we purchased, well ahead of time, is set to expire in about June. And even if we turned around and restocked our farm immediately, got brand new ducklings and started right up at the end of April when the quarantine order lifts, it of course takes about 4 to 6 months for a duck to be old enough to start laying eggs. Well, this feed that we have is layer feed. It's not nutritionally appropriate for ducklings. So it would be at least that 4 to 6 month period before we could feed it to them. The feed would expire during that time. Additionally, due to the timing of our particular case, those birds would be maturing in about November. And of course, birds that mature in the dead of winter don't usually start laying until the following spring. So this means that we are completely shut down, out of business, and won't have a single egg to sell until the following spring, probably about March. And at the same time, we would have all of these expenses of the feed, the electricity, the water, the labor, the bedding, everything, all the maintenance on the facilities to raise those birds back up to laying age. And we're also at the $10,000 of feed. So it's a business killer. It's bankrupting us.
Yeah, I can see how that would be the case. Now, what about something I just thought about? Now, I'm not in the poultry business. I'm not in the egg laying business. So I'm a little bit naive here. What about any kind of business insurance? Is there insurance that covers anything like that for the small commercial versus the big commercial? Or
There's the You can get insurance. We actually we do have insurance on our farm. We have liability insurance. We have property insurance. If there was a fire or an earthquake or something, the buildings would be covered. We did look into getting insurance on our actual birds. Unfortunately, being such a small farm, we don't really have access to fantastic rates, and the premiums would simply have not been worth the payout that we would have gotten for a flock of our size. So it was something that we looked into back in the day, and we elected not to have coverage on the birds because it wouldn't have paid out very much. And yeah, so we're kind of stuck on that front. The only compensation that we're getting is that little bit over $6,000 from the government. That's it.
because you're under 20,000 birds, is that right?
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And we
Well,
definitely did operate as a commercial flock. We had some wonderful customers in the area here. We supplied a couple of high-end Seattle restaurants. The one that most people would probably have heard of would be Wild Ginger. We supplied their Seattle and Bellevue locations. Moshi Moshi Sushi in Ballard. We also supplied Equus Restaurant at the Hyatt Regency in Bellevue, and a couple of specialty grocery stores. There was Ken's Market in Greenwood, Double D Meats in Mountlake Terrace, the delivery service Local Yokels in Seattle, as well as a bunch of local families. And we had wonderful stories from families who would buy our eggs either directly from the farm or from some of our retail partners. There was a family in Seattle that would walk to Ken's Market every week to pick up duck eggs to have Sunday brunch with the family there. A lot of these customers had a family member who were allergic to chicken eggs. So say the kid in the family was allergic to chicken eggs. That kid, had never been able to have a normal birthday cake or something because they couldn't have eggs. Well, they weren't allergic to duck eggs. It's a different protein. So thanks to our duck eggs, these kids could have their birthday cake. They could join the family for brunch and everything. And we were the only duck egg producer operating on really any sort of a large scale in the area here with pastured birds. So it was a market that there was definitely a demand for. We were looking to increase the flock. We actually had a 2-month wait list for our duck eggs at the time of the call. I mean, it was a great business model, and people really enjoyed the product.
so what do you think could have been done differently for the state of Washington? What would you? I know what I envision I would have wanted or expected if it were me in your shoes. But
Mhm.
what do you think would have been a more logical, amicable approach to what happened with you guys?
I definitely think that a quarantine would have been appropriate in our circumstance. We did have that sort of accidental natural experiment where, because of that delay in testing, we reported immediately, we did what we were supposed to. And due to the accident of holiday and weather, we had that week-long delay before we could get everyone retested and get those results. Since we had seen so many of the birds recover, ideally, we would have liked to open up as an experimental farm, essentially. We did approach the state and the USDA with that option. We said, look, we are willing to do whatever testing you see appropriate. We can observe the differences in these birds. We can see how they recover to health. Do they return to egg production? Are they going to, become unthrifty or something after recovering from this disease? Can we test for how long the virus does live in the soil? Because the data on that is actually a little bit sketchy. There's not as much information as I think we should have for that. Can we, monitor and follow up in quarantine and see just how this progresses and what we can do to help birds recover and treat them, and just what sort of a danger does this pose? That would have been our ideal, to open up as an experimental farm that we could study and monitor the progression of this disease in all of these different breeds of duck that we had here. Failing that, I still think that it would have been appropriate and humane to both the animals and, honestly, we farmers, if at least some of the birds could have remained here under quarantine. We had more than adequate facilities to house under cover without any exposure to wildlife, at least the pet flock, at least a nucleus of birds that we could have used to then repopulate and rebuild our flock. We had those unique genetics. We had that breed that we were trying to develop ourselves. we could have saved just a few birds, our pets, and a couple of our best breeders, kept them completely undercover for 120 days, had them retested to make sure that they were not contagious, that they were not continuing to shed the virus before letting them back out into the fields. And then we would have been in a much better position to recover our business. And we are very disappointed that that option was not offered.
Well, especially considering, as you said, you do have other smaller producers around you that have fowl that have been unimpacted. So
Correct.
clearly the efficiency of your own methods and practice within your own farm have been sufficient to that capacity. I mean, it has not been an outbreak beyond your borders, so to speak. And so I agree with you. I think that if that policy were to be amended or to be revisited in that capacity, it could tremendously help on a case-by-case basis to be able to look at an individual as an individual and to recognize that every topography and every scenario is absolutely independent in its own. So yeah, that's huge. Now, from what I understand, I'm curious on this. I've read a little bit that there is spread for this influenza to go from fowl to mammals now, and that there is a very low percentage, but it occasionally can spread to people. So did you think anything in that regard whenever you thought, oh my gosh, this could be what it is? Was that something that crossed you guys' minds?
Vaguely, we were certainly aware of that. My understanding is that we have definitely seen cases in predatory mammals. So that would be, scavengers, basically anything that would take the carcass of a dead wild bird. So foxes, I believe we've seen some cases in, some other wild canids. In birds, we've also seen birds of prey that preyed on sick individuals. So bald eagles, hawks, all sorts of things like that. I think a few owls as well. So basically, it's been all the animals that would consume a dead wild bird or an ill wild bird that they found that have gotten it. And it can be somewhat serious in them. So that was one thing that we were definitely concerned about, especially as we were burying our lost birds during that week delay period. We consulted with the state, and it was agreed that burying them would be the most appropriate. So we made sure that those graves were extra deep to make sure that not only no wild birds could come in, or wild animals could come in contact with it, but that our own dogs would not come in contact with them. As far as spread to humans, it was something that we were aware of. I believe that there have been 4 cases, I think, around the globe of people who have contracted it. And in every case, it was people who had extremely close contact with sick birds. So I believe that the one in the US that I'd heard of was a line worker who worked in a slaughterhouse who was handling a lot of dead carcasses at that point. Everyone who came out to the farm from the WSDA and the USDA wore full body hazmat gear at all times. And they advised us to wear PPE as well. Of course, since we were in close contact with those sick birds during that week-long delay, we certainly had every opportunity to potentially contract it ourselves. So we were very careful to do a lot of hand washing and everything, not kiss the birds, that sort of thing. And our local health department did also follow up with us following the positive test results at the same day, a couple days later, and then 10 days later, just to make sure that we were healthy and symptom free. And thankfully, we have had absolutely no symptoms. So when we were well beyond the danger period, luckily. So for humans, we are completely safe. So we understand that there is the potential there, and no one wants to see it jump species. There's some thought that the 1918 influenza pandemic in humans could have been started as bird flu. So yeah, it could be a major problem. And that's all the more reason that we need to find better preventative measures to stop this from spreading among the nation's flocks, because none of us want to catch it. That would be really bad.
Right. We've already got enough going on right now. No,
exactly.
Well, and I think that may be lending a little bit to why there is a level of distrust among individuals who question whether or not it even is a thing. I have briefly said that it's something that, I mean, admittedly, I hadn't even really paid a lot of attention to, just because when I had heard of it, I thought, oh, it's just for wildfowl. It's not something that's really applicable to my backyard flock.
Mm-hmm.
But as time has progressed, just in the last, several, gosh, what has it been? The last 20 years, there's been a major progression in this scenario of issues. So it's something that I think that people should be paying attention to, and heeding stories like your own, and recognizing caution that needs to be taken as far as the care of all of your flock friends.
Definitely. I wish that this wasn't real. I wish it was just some made up scam or something, but it is unfortunately very real. And the suffering of our birds was very, very real. And the reason that I think that we had such a high survival rate is because we had waterfowl. So in waterfowl, there is a lot of natural resistance. I firmly believe that there is a differing level of resistance between different breeds, and there is a lot of studies out there to show that. Not so much in ducks, but there's actually a lot in chickens and such. Like there's even a study showing different strains of Rhode Island Red. So even within the same breed of chicken, there are some individuals with a genetic resistance to HPAI. So we can be breeding for more resistance in our flocks, and I feel that that is vital to preventing HPAI outbreaks in future. But we were that lucky because we had waterfowl, and ducks are naturally more resistant to this disease than some other poultry. I understand that turkeys are pretty darn susceptible, and chickens are very susceptible. There are many cases where even if it's caught fairly quickly, by the time the state or government comes out to depopulate a flock of chickens, they're already dead. Within 24 hours, they will just unfortunately succumb to the disease and just keel over. So it is very real. It is very scary. It is a very bad disease that we need to take seriously.
Yeah.
However, our response as a nation to this threat has been inadequate and antiquated, and we need to change things up because it's only getting worse. It hasn't been working. We wouldn't be in this position if our current control strategies were as effective as we'd like them to be.
So how upon visiting your website, I was I was relieved to see that you've made it rather easy for people to participate in lending a voice to how they feel about this situation. So if you wouldn't mind, in your own words, just explaining some of your own suggestions on how someone could voice their opinion or try to make a difference in how these situations are kind of unfolding now.
Oh, thank you. Yes, we're really, really encouraging people to speak out about this. If you have birds, if you buy eggs, if you've ever been to a local farm or petting zoo, if you've gone to the farmer's market and had a good time, know that those small farms are at risk from exactly this and from the government policies that are unfortunately not helping to curb the spread of HPAI. We need to support local farms. We need to make sure that compensation is improved. And we need to make sure that we are changing our strategy to focus not just on elimination, but on prevention. We need to look into ways to stop the virus from not only getting to our flocks, but from affecting individuals within that flock. We need to build that resistance in the nation's poultry flocks, and especially on small farms. So we really urge people to write to your local representatives, both at the state level and at the national level. Contact your senator, contact your state senators, contact your local representatives, contact people at the USDA. You can write directly into the USDA and yell at them. The more noise that we make, the more we tell them that we are dissatisfied with the current policies and how that is impacting egg supplies locally, the more they're going to have to listen to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I found it interesting. There were a few remarks on the register's notice that was saying, well, they shouldn't be doing it. The government shouldn't be doing anything. They need to get out of policies altogether. And while we each hold our own opinions in regards to that, I feel like recognition that there are these policies that are currently in place, and taking a step to vocalize when there's an option, like right now, they have opened the floor for comment. And so the very best someone could do at this point is, as you said, knock on those doors, make your voice heard so that you can be a participant instead of a observer or a, I don't know what the right word would be. I was going to say
Passive,
yes, just a passive individual that does it. That's just having something done to them instead of, being an active participant.
Exactly. Make your voice heard. They need to hear from you. They're not going to change unless they hear from you. And if we all yell at them, they've got to listen to us. So every voice counts. Please contact, write in, email in, call, whatever you want to do, whatever you're most comfortable doing. Contact your local representatives, contact the USA, put those comments in there and tell them what you think.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And also something that I was curious about, sidebar, I'm going to back up a little bit.
Sure.
Whenever they tested your flock for the influenza, did they test for the antibodies also? Because, I mean, once you get a virus, you build up those antibodies. They've clearly had built up those antibodies. So is the testing able to discriminate or differentiate between the antibodies versus the actual active virus? Do you know? Did they answer you about that?
My understanding is that it's really not, that they are testing for the antibodies and that the presence of the antibodies are what leads them to believe that there's an active infection when combined with the observable symptoms. And that's actually part of the challenge here. So one option that we have on the table for prevention for HPAI is vaccination. And there are a number of vaccines. They have been used in many other countries, in Egypt, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in China, in all sorts of different areas, Vietnam. They have been using them for decades even, and they've had great effect. In Egypt, for example, they had a very devastating outbreak of HPAI about a decade ago. They elected to begin vaccinating the nation's flocks. And while the disease hasn't been eliminated, they have gotten to the point where their birds are protected enough that they've actually started exporting poultry products, which is something that nation had never done before. So vaccinations can help. And there's a range out there that we can choose from, that we can investigate, that show great promise. In ducks, there's an excellent study out there that shows that a combination of two different vaccines will provide near 100% protection for quite an extended period. And the ducks do wonderfully on this. So there's some really great stuff out there that we can be looking into. The reason that the United States has not been pursuing vaccination is largely because of foreign trade. So when we export poultry products, which we do a lot, it's a very lucrative business, nations that are purchasing those will test the products for the presence of HPAI. But in order to do that, they're looking for the antibodies. So when you vaccinate a bird, of course, that causes them to produce antibodies so that if they are exposed to the virus, their immune system's ready to go and will take it out quickly. So when they get those test results back and it says there's antibodies here, they don't know if it's because the bird was vaccinated or because they have an active infection. And so they may just go, oh, well, we can't tell and we really don't want the bird flu here, so we're just going to throw out the whole shipment. So it impacts international trade. The almighty dollar kind of always wins. And so that's why the USDA has not been pursuing the idea of vaccination to this point. Now, that has just recently changed. Word has just come out that the USDA is getting ready to begin to study vaccinations in poultry as a potential way to combat HPAI. This just came out, I believe, 2 or 3 days ago. So that's great that they're going to at least take a look at it and see whether or not this will work. There are decades of studies out there that we can draw on that show that different vaccines have differing levels of effectiveness. Some can be even administered in ovo. So you have your fertilized egg, you put the vaccination right into the egg, and then as soon as the chick or duckling is born, they're immediately born with immunity. So that's a fantastic way to go. There are vaccines that can be administered via injection to adults or via eye drops or even in the water. So there's a lot of ways that it will be easy for even smallholders to administer to their birds. Even if you're not used to giving birds shots, you can still put it in their water, put it in the eye drops, something like that. So there's a lot of ways that we could be using this as just another tool in the toolbox to help develop immunity while we work on breeding for greater immunity in the nation's flocks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like you've done a lot of research on
So
this.
much.
It sounds like you really kind of dug in because, and rightfully so, with things happening the way that they have for you, being an active participant, you kind of had to step up there, and you've it sounds like you've done quite a bit of research there. So that's
I know
that's
way
very
more than
helpful.
I ever wanted to.
Well, and on that note, are there any in your own research that you have done, were there any resources that you found particularly helpful for individuals themselves who are like, oh my gosh, I don't know how I feel about this, but I need to know more? So what would you suggest as resources for that?
Yeah, there's a lot of very confusing information out there. The government does have some good information, but they also have a real problem with not adequately communicating it between different departments. For example, when we were contacted by our local health department, they were way out of date on, what information was coming down from the USDA. We actually ended up educating them more than they were educating us. They didn't realize that the USDA had dropped the quarantine period from 150 to 120 days and all sorts of other stuff. So some good information out there on government websites. We have found that actually the best information is available usually through universities. So if you find something on a university page, that's probably going to be the best out there. Scientific studies, there's a lot of papers out there. You can actually even do just a Google search on HPAI in chickens, ducks, poultry, et cetera. So that'll get you a lot of good information. We have posted a lot of good info on the farm's Facebook page, and I'm in the process of consolidating that up onto the farm's website, so hearthandhaven.com. And we're going to put all the information that we have gathered up there, links to the studies that we think are the most interesting, a walkthrough of what happened with our flock, kind of a timeline of, what went down with our birds. So I'm hoping that that'll be another useful resource for people as well. But universities are usually the best way to go, and they have the best information.
Okay, good. Well, I appreciate you compiling and delivering all of that information for the general populace so that people can, again, educate themselves on personal experience and ways that you've found things to be helpful to you in this scenario.
Definitely.
Let me see if there's anything else I am missing. I guess, yeah. So you had mentioned somewhat about how the flocks around you have been perfectly fine. But you did mention that depending on if that would have been a larger commercial operation, that could have been a different conversation as far as how things would have or wouldn't have maybe been handled. I guess with you, it was still kind of down to zero. You are beginning again, reset button. But what is something that the fowl community, I guess you would say, the bird community, what is something, whether you are a large scale, small scale, backyard, lover of chickens and ducks and geese or what have you, what is something that you think that people within the community of that production can do to kind of stand together in an alliance about this?
Absolutely. I think that there's several things that we can all do together. The first is, of course, if you have birds of your own, do the best that you can to keep them healthy and protected. Add netting, make sure that your biosecurity practices are top notch. Do whatever you can to minimize the exposure of your birds to wild waterfowl, especially. Be really careful with any equipment that you move on or off your farm. Maybe consider skipping shows and such, any situation where you'll be moving birds to another location. Make sure that you're quarantining any new birds that you're adding to your flock 30 days, at least 30 feet away, just to make sure they're not bringing anything in. The maximum incubation period for HPAI is 21 days. So make sure that you're keeping any new additions away for 21 days, just in case. Do whatever you can to boost your flock's health. There's actually some interesting studies about how feeding them mushrooms can improve their immune response. That's something I was just learning about recently. So make sure that they're getting the best diet that you can possibly afford. Give them lots of delicious treats. Maybe try adding some mushrooms, make sure that they've got all the nutrition that they need to keep them healthy. If anything goes down, do the best that you can to test, to keep them safe, to keep others around you safe. Minimizing the spread between flocks is going to be key. But what we have seen so far and what we were told by a USDA veterinarian is that the spread between adjacent properties has been absolutely minimal. There's some other diseases, Newcastle disease, for example, where, if one flock gets it, the people next door definitely get it too, even if the birds, never even get that close to each other. Even if you have a fence and keep them completely separated, it's just that airborne. That doesn't seem to be true with HPAI. Feces seems to be the main method of spread, contact with that contaminated feces. So as long as you can keep that under control, hopefully that will prevent that from, either coming to your flock or spreading to anyone else. And then on a larger scale, what we can all do is make sure that we're educating the public about what a challenge this is. And we need to work together to change this policy. We need to work together to keep our flocks healthy, to build that natural immunity, to breed for birds that are naturally resistant to this. Because unfortunately, it's not going to go away. We've seen that this has been around for a couple of years. The government kept hoping that as migratory waterfowl headed off to their, winter breeding grounds, that it would just kind of magically mutate and go away. Well, it hasn't. And that wishful thinking is not getting us anywhere. So we need to take charge of this. We need to make sure that we're doing what we can to breed healthy, resistant birds that can do their best to avoid this virus and stand up to it if it does show up. And then we need to make sure that we get the government on our side, providing adequate compensation for any affected keepers who are losing their flocks, and then doing what we can to make sure that nobody has to go through this again. We don't want anyone else to have to go through this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe doing a little research to make sure you're thoroughly vetted on your state,
Yes.
what the state policy is and what variables there are in that capacity to, or, for or against what you're currently, working with, because I definitely see how there would be a lot of producers very hesitant to report issues.
Yes.
Because if there's not appropriate assistance, then why would they invite that?
Yes, that's definitely
that
something
headache.
we've seen.
So
yeah, I've been approached personally by a lot of people throughout the nation, dozens and dozens of folks who said, that's awful. And if that happened to me, I'm not sure if I'd report. And that's a problem, because if we do put people in that horrible situation where they have that terrible choice to make and people choose not to report and the virus keeps circulating silently, it's just going to keep getting worse and worse. So we need to make sure that we've set things up so that people will report, so that it's worth it to them, and so that they won't necessarily be losing everything by doing so. So yeah, that's a huge reason why we need this change, is because otherwise, unfortunately, more birds are going to suffer, more people are going to suffer. And the more that the virus circulates, the more chances it has to mutate and potentially jump species to humans, to dogs, to cats, to whatever. So we really need to make sure that we're nipping that in the bud and that people do have that chance to report without losing everything, so that we can stay on top of this and manage this properly.
yeah, absolutely. You had mentioned a little while back that the primary seeming transmission is through feces and dead carcasses. So I'm wondering, because so many people use, like I use the poultry litter as compost. I mean, I will take and I will put that into the compost. Now, does that kill off? And because of the heat of the compost, does that kill off the virus? And it's like, you may or may not know the answer to that. I'm curious. I'm like, does it kill that?
Yeah. And that's something that we asked about, because as we're cleaning out our duck houses, then yeah, we need to know what to do with the contaminated bedding. So yes, the word from the WSDA and the USDA is that yes, a hot compost pile will kill it. We often have fairly cool compost piles here on our farm, and we just let them go slow. That's usually not hot enough to kill the virus. But if you have a hot one, if it's steaming, yes, definitely hot enough. So if you can ramp up that compost, add your greens, make sure that you've got your right, green and brown balance, and really get it cooking, it definitely will. In our case, we've been advised to muck out the stalls, make sure that we get the compost as hot as we can, and put a tarp over it so that, wild birds can't just land right on there, and heat that up as much as possible and compost that. So yeah, if you want to be extra careful, yeah, crank up the heat of that compost and you should be good. Heat definitely kills the virus.
Okay, very good. All right. Is there, I guess, anything else that you would like to, first of all, absolutely, how can people get a hold of you and find you and do all those lovely things if they want to be a more active participant in what you're doing?
Definitely. Yeah, please visit our website. That's hearthandhaven.com. And if you go to hearthandhaven.com/savethefarm, you will find links there to a whole bunch of representatives that you can contact. We have a list of folks here in Washington State and then nationally, that folks, nationally and internationally can contact and write in and tell them what you think about these policies. We also have a sample letter there. Feel free to copy and paste the letter, riff on that, whatever you would like to do. It's all up for grabs. And yeah, send in your own words, especially what you think about all of this and what changes you would like to see made. We really appreciate that. We're also on Facebook and Instagram and such. Links to that are all on the webpage.
Okay, very good. Now, Oh, there was something that I was just going to say and it went out of my brain. Hold that thought.
No worries.
Oh, your
I
future.
probably should plug our GoFundMe too, but
Your future. What is the future of Hearth and Haven? Now, I mean, you're literally pressing the reset button. You do have the grounds, but you have to hold the grounds in silence for quite a while. So what does the future look like for you? Is your clientele saying, I'm gonna hang on? I mean, business is business. So what happens for you guys now?
It's still a bit up in the air. We love doing this. This was a dream come true. Absolutely love this. I've never loved any job so much. Left IT to get back to the land, and this is a real passion project. It's rough at this point. It's such a financial hit. We're quite bankrupted by this. So whether or not we'll be able to come back as a commercial farm, I don't know. We did set up a GoFundMe, and the response from the community has been wonderful. We haven't quite hit our goal, but we're not. We're thankfully we're to the point that we're not in danger of losing the farm. So thank you everyone so much. We're so glad we'll be able to keep it. I don't know if we'll be able to come back as a commercial operation, especially with duck eggs again, mainly because there's no guarantee that this wouldn't happen again. I mean, in a week, in a month, and whatever. So we definitely want to have some birds around again, just for ourselves, if nothing else, because we miss them terribly. We are about to get some piglets. We're gonna, run a bunch of hogs out there because we can keep those kind of on the edges of the property, away from the areas that the ducks were. We're also about to get some goats, just a couple of goats to give our livestock guardian dog something to take care of. She's been very thrown off by this. Suddenly, all of her charges were gone. I couldn't even get her to go out on walks for a few days. So we need to give her her job back, get her something to do. And luckily, goats are immune to HPAI, so we'll get them set up. She'll have a job again. We'll at least have that. So goats and piglets are the first step, and we'll see what the rest of the year brings.
Okay, very good. Now for the goats, are you guys going to do like a dairy breed goat? Or are you going to do like a milk breed, hair breed? I mean, there's lots of options there. So
yeah, we're actually going to get dairy goats. We're getting 2 Nigerian dwarfs and a La Mancha from another local, actually a goat cheese farm that's just a couple hours from us. And for the pigs, we're getting 3 different breeds. We're getting Mangalistas. I always get that one wrong. I think it's Mangalista.
I don't know if I've heard of it. I'll have to go search it now.
the woolly ones. So for pigs, we're getting 3 different heritage breeds, all from local farms as well. So that's thanks to the funds from our GoFundMe. We're doing our best to pay it forward to other local farms.
I love that.
Getting some equipment and some adorable animals from some of our friends in the area.
Very good. Well, so there's bright future in one way or the other, at least. So, okay. Well, good. And I want to thank you for taking the time to chat with me again today. Again, this is a different thing than I usually do, but I felt like with it being such a urgent issue with not only our food security with the eggs and the significant losses that have been seen between things catching on fire and, just low production and just things in the egg production realm. And then on top of that, to see the progression of this HPAI, it just, I felt like it was worth a conversation and people getting out there. I believe it is the 17th that the comments close. Is that correct? Your Department of Agriculture on the register? It's under the Federal Register notices, right? And it's I'll put all the links on all the things, and that way people can get in there and have their voice be heard. Perfect.
And the way that they phrased that call for comment there, I think a lot of people find confusing because it's very much government speak. So to kind of translate that, essentially APHIS, so that's a branch. Yeah, exactly.
I had to highlight USDA. And look it up. So go ahead.
It's so confusing. So basically a part of the USDA, one of their departments is saying, hey guys, we've been doing this, HPAI response this way for so long, and we're kind of not sure if we want to keep doing it this way, or if we want to step back and just let the states handle it and not do anything at the government level, or if we should be open to new stuff and have new approaches. Which do you think, which of those 3 options, either we keep doing it the way we have, we step back and let the states handle it, or we kind of stay involved, but we also research new options. Which of those does the public want us to do? So this is our opportunity to tell them exactly what we want them to do. So yeah, respond to that. Please comment on that. Tell them which one of those options you think sounds good and why, or do you want another option they haven't thought of? They're also looking for people to explain to them, like, really what has the impact been on the ground of their policies so far, and what might they not be considering? So yeah, please dump it all on them. And if for whatever reason you missed that 17th deadline for commenting here, don't worry about it. Please go ahead and send in comments directly to the USDA, to your local representatives. They're working on the Farm Bill right now. It's the perfect time to be yelling at folks.
There's lots of that going on right now.
Yeah. Join the conversation.
Let your voice be heard.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I appreciate, again, you taking the time. And guys, be sure to check out what they've got going on. Elaine is a very sweet, sweet gal to take the time to chat with us. And I hope that every single person gets an opportunity to say what they want to say. Let their voice be heard.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yes,
you guys are doing such great work here.
Oh, thank you. We try. We're hoping that we do. So
it makes such a difference. It really does. We need to get the word out.